drop you on the escalator. Yeah.
Please take your seats and we will start. It's going to be an informal, in a sense, discussion. I just was looking forward to seeing Anil, Dr. Anil Seth again. We had a podcast together before, and I'm impressed with his work. He's a professor at the University of Sussex, a great researcher, very well published, researching different aspects in neurophysiology, the brain, and got interested himself in consciousness and now AI also. Mm-hmm. And we need today all different approaches, really at different conversions of knowledge in order to try to explain consciousness. Science has not come to the field of consciousness until very recently, except just theories about, consciousness, different states of consciousness, vegetative state, coma, waking, dreaming, sleeping, the normal states of consciousness. But where is consciousness? Where does it come from? Has been kind of not in the realm of science, and we didn't know enough to put our finger on that. So Dr. Seth has, I'll be calling him Anil.
Yeah, please.
Has looked into that. I have personally looked into that from different perspectives also. We both have written about it. I tend to say that we agree on everything that is, of course, factual. That's what science does. Maybe you will find that we might come to a different conclusion at the end, but that's the advantage of being able to discuss something from different perspectives and see what arguments can be given to whether, for example, consciousness is primary or it's the product of the brain. And if it's a product of the brain, how can the brain actually come to this invention of consciousness? But we'll go through that. I want to say to start with that it's not a question of belief. It's a question of looking at it from a rational, scientific perspective and not bring in factors that are what we would call supernatural, like supernatural forces. In science, we don't usually like to delve into that because you can imagine anything. If you imagine some divinity doing all kinds of things, then it's just an imagination, and it's hard to support scientifically. It becomes what we call dogma. From my perspective, science also has some dogmas. We will see if we can get into that. Mm-hmm. And particularly, without making you wait too long, the dogma that everything is physical and material, which I take the...
All right.
Right, exactly. It's a provocative kind of discussion. It's gonna be. That's what will make it interesting. And so we have first to define consciousness, obviously, because we are discussing something. If I have a definition and Anil has a different definition, we would be arguing about two different things. So consciousness, from my perspective, has a range of possibilities, and there is human consciousness. But I'd like first to ask Anil to tell us how he likes us to discuss consciousness from his perspective. And I will try to show my interpretation of what consciousness is, actually, so I can fit it in my paradigm.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. And by the way, thank you all for coming. And just to say, I think the logistics of this is we'll talk for a while, but there's going to leave plenty of time for Q&A and open discussion as well, because we're a nice, intimate group here. So definitely want time for that. And consciousness is one of those things I think most of us have thought of. We all think about it. Maybe we get sort of educated out of thinking about it, and for most of us. But one of the beautiful things about it as a topic is that it does really invite consideration from different disciplines. So I'm very happy to have this chance again, because my training is as a sort of neuroscientist with a background, also a PhD in AI originally. So this sort of mix of philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, and I think Tony's background in medicine, but also as a leading figure in transcendental meditation, is a very different combination of experiences and expertise. So this is why I think this is where the magic can really happen. So thank you for organizing this. I didn't have anything to do with that, so it's a great pleasure.
For accepting. It's a joy to be with you.
So every conversation, I think, definitions are useful not because they're the final word, but because we don't want to be completely talking past each other or past any of you. So I'm not expecting everybody to agree with this definition, but just want to say, put on the table how I find it useful to think about it. And the definition of consciousness that I like to start from comes from a philosopher called Thomas Nagel, who in the 1970s, a very famous paper of What It Is Like to Be a Bat, which was sort of challenging us to imagine the inner world of an organism very different from ourselves. He was making other points too. But in that paper, he puts down a definition which has become rather a classic and a standard, which is that for a conscious organism, or we could say, now that we have AI, a conscious system in general, there is something it is like to be that organism. What he means by that is that it feels like something to be me, it feels like something to be each one of you, but it doesn't feel like anything to be this table or a glass of water, or I would say this iPhone. Another way of saying is any kind of experience whatsoever counts. It's the difference between having some kind of experience and being an object. The other way to put it, as you will know as a neurologist, is what goes away when you go under general anesthesia and what comes back on the other side of that. Different from sleep, where in sleep you always know that some amount of time has passed and you might have some kind of experiences during most stages of sleep, not only dreaming. In general anesthesia, you're just gone. Could have been 5 minutes, could have been 5 years, you're an object. So consciousness is the opposite of general anesthesia.
Wonderful. I agree that consciousness is that, which is obvious. But in order to truly find the full value of what ultimate reality is, if we go to that extent, and see and solve the problem of dualism versus monism, idealism versus physicalism, I find myself obliged to extend and expand the definition of consciousness and say that consciousness is not only human-like consciousness, and it's not only self-awareness, and it's not only the ability to recognize the self, for example, in a mirror, but, and this will sound radical and extreme, any sensing, any detecting, any feeling, any reacting by anything with anything else is within the range of what I would like to call manifest consciousness in the universe, which takes us really to a very completely different definition than the anthropomorphic, which means a human-like projection of what consciousness is, which means to be conscious like a human being, to be able to know what it is like to be a bat is a certain level of consciousness, which for me is higher than, for example, to feel something and respond to it. So it's really a new way, from my perspective, of looking at the range of consciousness. So what I'm saying is that we can put consciousness in a range from a high level of consciousness to almost non-consciousness, completely zero, meager level of consciousness. And that is a problem for the discussion in a sense, but also can be illuminating in terms of trying to find the origin of consciousness, for example. Where does it come from, this consciousness? So for me, an animal is a conscious entity, a tree is a conscious entity. But if you try to say that the tree is conscious like the animal, or the animal is conscious like the human being, you would be completely wrong. That's not the idea.
I think we should clarify where we differ, though, because
Right.
I think there's already some things where we clearly do, but I think there's other areas where we don't, and you might think that we do, but we don't. So nothing in what I said necessarily ties consciousness to the human example, or to things like explicit self-awareness. Now, we as humans, we always, I think we both agree, we always struggle with this. Like, we know what it's like to be a human being. Some features of that way of experiencing the world and the self are contingent. You know, that just is the way humans happen to be. It's not a necessary feature of consciousness in general. So I totally agree. Certainly other species will have a very different way of experiencing the world and the self. And I think I've been thinking quite a bit about that, especially for non-human animals, because of the welfare implications. So we don't want to get drawn into the anthropocentric trap of thinking that the human way is the only way, or the archetypal way. Self-awareness is, you know, not there in a human infant, but it's something that's not necessary for consciousness in general. So I think we agree about that. But I think where we still differ is, I think you are, because you're a very generous person, you're more generous about the attribution of consciousness to things in the world. So I think I don't feel that merely the ability to sense things is likely to be sufficient. The reason being that many things could be said to sense things. The thermostat in my central heating system at home could be said to sense the temperature of the room. You know, my car senses various things. Is that enough? Or even in very simple, very, very, very simple animals, and maybe here you'll say, well, that's fine. But, you know, even a single-celled paramecium will sense and respond to its environment. And in human beings, we know that we can contrast, or we can distinguish mere sensation from conscious perception. So there are plenty of experimental examples where people show that they're sensitive to something in the environment, like a very brief flash of an image, and it can affect their behavior. It's called priming, but they're not conscious of it at all. So I think we agree that it's not just the human case and self-awareness, but we might disagree about whether mere sensitivity is sufficient. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's absolutely fair in the sense that it fits in what I'd like to see as consciousness, but I am taking the liberty of extending the definition of consciousness to sensing. So that becomes, you know, maybe we should call it something else, but for the search for the ultimate reality and whether the ultimate unified field, which we can get into, if it exists as a unified field of all the laws of nature, is a field of consciousness or a field of physical energy, it fits my definition.
Well, that's nice for you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
It's the way
it's a befitting thing.
Yeah.
Now the question is, so that's our differing definitions. Let's go back to the understanding of consciousness from the perspective of how it emerges, what is its origin. And for that, you know, we have to define briefly the problem, the mind-body problem a little bit, and or the hard problem of consciousness, if you like. I mean, we can both do it, but I'd like you to
Sure.
give an overview, so a platform on which we can build our logics.
Sure. So this is this idea of the hard problem. How many people know the hard problem of consciousness? I've come across a few of you. So it's due to another philosopher, David Chalmers. And it's a way of thinking about all these different isms that you just mentioned: dualism, monism, materialism, physicalism, panpsychism. We can go through those as well, but I suggest we don't sort of run through them. Bit dull. But the basic intuition And the reason why consciousness has mystified so many people from so many different cultures and traditions and backgrounds for so long is that it seems as though, on the one hand, we have stuff, just material stuff. Our brains are made of carbon, organized very sophisticatedly, at one level, anyway. So we have stuff, and on the other hand, we have experience. And we have the redness of red, and this is back to the definition. When I open my eyes in the morning, it's not just that my brain is responding to light coming in. I experience seeing the world around me. There's color, there's shape, there's shade, there's light, there's sound. And it doesn't seem as though any explanation of things happening in physical stuff could ever explain how and why there's anything like experience at all. That's the hard problem. David Chalmers puts it like this. He said, it's widely agreed that, well, I have to try and remember now, that, I'll be paraphrasing a bit, that conscious experiences depend on physical processing, but it is unclear how and why this is the case. It seems objectively unreasonable that it should, but yet it does. And this hard problem has been the kind of rock upon which many explanations or suggested explanations of consciousness have founded over the years. Some people try to solve it head on and say, no, it's this aspect of stuff happening in the brain. Well, that is consciousness, whether that is activity in a particular part of the brain, which raises the question, well, why? Or maybe synchrony between activity in different brain regions, or all sorts of other things. But if I can just go for a minute longer, I think it's the wrong way to look at it, and I have a lot of respect for David Chalmers. But I think that thinking of consciousness as one big scary mystery in search of one eureka solution is probably not the correct or the most productive way to think about it. Partly to annoy David Chalmers, I talk about the real problem of consciousness rather than the hard problem. And that is the problem of just say consciousness exists, because, by the way, as you know, there are some philosophers that just say, no, consciousness doesn't even exist, so what are you worried about? Sort of, yeah, depending on which day. But consciousness exists.
You work with that.
Yeah, well, yes, a little bit.
You called him my mentor at some point.
Yeah, he's been part of my academic life for a long time. We've never published together, I don't think.
So there are some people who say consciousness doesn't exist at all. It's
and then but it will vary. We say, and then you'll say, do you mean we're all unconscious? And they'll say, no, it just means that it exists, but not in the way you think of it, which is a very, very slippery answer. But it might be a good answer. So this real problem of consciousness says, no, consciousness exists. When I have an experience, there's a there. There really is something happening, which is the experience of pain, pleasure, redness, or whatever it might be. But instead of looking for the special source that magics this experience out of mechanism, I prefer to try to say, well, what are the features of this experience beyond the fact that it's experience? What is a visual experience like? It has spatiality, it has objects, they have arrangements in a spatial frame that change over time. An emotional experience is different. It has valence. Things are good or bad, and so on and so on. And I think if you can begin to explain the properties like this of different kinds of conscious experiences in terms of what's happening in the brain, then bit by bit, this sense of mystery that consciousness cannot be explained in terms of stuff will gradually, and is gradually, dissolving, and may eventually fade away, and then we'll have it actually makes sense to think of consciousness in this materialist way as something that is entailed by particular arrangements of matter. And there's a good analogy for this in the history, which is how scientists came to understand life. And only 150 years ago, many people thought life was beyond the reach of science. You needed something supernatural, right? Back to that, some spark of life, some élan vital. But of course you don't, right? And philosophers didn't say that life doesn't exist or that everything is alive. They said, no, look, life has many properties, and as you try to explain those, then this hard problem of life, it went away. And that's, I think, at least a good strategy. It may not be successful for consciousness, but it's been successful before. And the closing point on this is that just because something seems mysterious now with the tools and the methods that we have now, just does not mean that it always will be mysterious. It has this beautiful property of demystifying, but not taking the grandeur or the wonder out of it, but taking the supernatural necessity out of something. And that's my hope for how the neuroscience of consciousness will evolve.
So in other words, to come to some terminology used in philosophy and science, this is the problem of the realism of consciousness. Is consciousness a real thing? And the realism of matter is matter real also in that sense? And the other part is also, in this case, a term that is often used, that consciousness is an emergent quality. So it emerges from something, which means there is a point in the evolution where the complexity and orderliness of the nervous system leads to some new phenomenon, which is a phenomenon of consciousness. And therefore, we call consciousness here as an emerging. It emerges from that, and that's it. So that comes to the big question, philosophical questions, about the reality of life, about, if we want to transpose this a little bit in order to come to a bigger perspective, what is reality actually? What is the real reality? We don't want to go into detail into this monism, dualism, etc., but there is an aspect of us which is subjective, personal, that's consciousness. There is an aspect which we call physical, material. Descartes thought they are both kind of existing and they are separate. Nobody knows how they talk to each other.
That's dualism.
Dualism. Nobody's interested in this because nobody knows how they can talk to each other. There are then two schools, to summarize in general. One that says that everything is physical material, and one that says that actually, no, everything is consciousness or some way spiritual, without having to go to the supernatural aspect, if we can. The problem with idealists, they call them the idealists, which think that ideas come before matter, is that they cannot explain how from matter, from non-physical, non-material consciousness emerges the universe. I call this if you are an idealist, it's the hard problem of physicalness, how do you explain?
Yeah, no, the problem isn't mind, it's matter.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly. And so for the physicalists, how then is the hard problem, how consciousness emerges? So I take the attitude, and I try to give it the logic, that consciousness is primary, and then try to explain how, from consciousness, we actually have a universe which is with its dynamics. It's a complicated problem, but I delved into it, and I don't know if the time will allow to at least give an idea of how it works. Whereas we have the scientists, the modern scientists, who feel that it's an emergent quality. It emerges from the physical complexification and orderliness. Now, I'd like to challenge that by trying to say and discuss with Anil, who has been into this, what is actually reality? First, can we say how we perceive reality? And you worked on this, that that reality is not just the object out there, but there is a construction of reality that involves how our brain works. Mm-hmm. And we know that. Would you like to share some of those important aspects?
Thank you. Yeah, it's actually, so my first time here at TED, at Vancouver TED in 2017, when I gave a talk, they gave my talk the title, Your Brain Hallucinates Your Conscious Reality, which got me into all kinds of trouble.
Not confabulate.
No, that's what AI does. So, but because it's close to what I wanted to say in some way, but it gives the wrong impression. The wrong impression it gives is that objective reality, the things that the universe in general, is just made up by your brain. But that doesn't make any sense because your brain is part of that wider reality anyway. So it doesn't make sense to think like that. And it was not what I was trying to say. There are two different ways to think of reality here. One is what actually is. What is the universe really? Is it, one option is kind of some sort of mental state, or it's quarks or superstrings or whatever it might be. The other is what do we experience as being real in our everyday lives? Looking around this room now, we experience it as being real, at least I hope we do. I experience the colors of your different clothes as really being those colors, and time is really passing, and so on. And that is not identical to what's there, whatever it is, whether it's mental states or superstrings. Like, clearly my experience of what is real is not a direct window into what really is. And this is not a new observation. In Western philosophy, Kant says this long ago about the noumenon. You can never know what's really there. It's only ever...
the thing in itself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the line that I've been exploring is to try to explain, to take the materialist perspective that what's really there is independent of our minds, just there. Or at least most things. Color is a good example of something that's not mind independent. Colors just don't exist without minds to interpret them. There's just frequencies of light.
Electromagnetic.
And the particular kind of physical system that the brain is always trying to make its best guess about the causes of the sensory signals that it gets, the colorless light waves, let's say, that come into the eye. The brain is always trying to figure out, well, what most likely caused these things? And that is what we experience. And that is what we experience as being real. It would be very confusing. Evolution would have really screwed up if the contents of our experience were experienced as being unreal. It would be a very weird way to build an experiencing system. So it's no surprise to me that we're built to conflate these things. We're built to perceive things as really part of objective reality when they're in fact part of our brain's controlled hallucination. So this is where I use the hallucination to kind of emphasize that all of our experiences come from within. So hallucinations typically refer to things that are not there, that we experience things that are not there.
How about calling it construct?
Well, I think that may be a better term. I think it's a construct, an active interpretation, at best guess. Yeah. But it's not arbitrary. It's controlled by what's out there in the world.
There is something out there,
or in the, yeah.
But its own reality, it's by itself, is not necessarily what we experience.
Right, and the same goes for the self. So this is the other aspect of it. So there's been one kind of flip where the world that we experience isn't a readout of what's there just pouring itself into our minds. It's an active construction. And then the self, which we sort of, if we're brought up in the Western tradition, you might think of the self as this little mini-me inside my head peering out, and like, oh yeah, there's this chair, and
the spirit,
figuring out what, the spirit, the soul, and figuring out what to do next. And the self, in this case, is also a construct. It's another kind of perceptual best guess, another kind of controlled hallucination. So all there is this just collection of perceptual best guesses. And the different kinds of best guesses, that explains why the ongoing flow of conscious experience for this biological object seems divided into self and world, and within the self into body and free will and emotion. But there's one underlying common process.
Yeah, beautiful. So this, in a sense, makes us doubt about the reality on the surface level in terms of how we see it. That's a very important starting point for my theory. But it's a very important research and consideration because we think that things are absolutely exactly like we see them, blue and red and yellow and all of that. But we forget that we are actually constructing the world based on the machinery of our nervous system and what it allows us to see, our memories, our expectations, etc. Now, if you take a different machine that has different frequency of light that it can detect or that can work much faster or it can detect, electromagnetic waves of radio frequency and all of that. Let's say our eyes don't see only within those red and violet range, but can see infrared or even more, ultraviolet, X-ray, and radio frequency. This room will be filled with solid things, because they will be there. We would experience them as there. So the question comes, what is reality in a sense? And that's what physics has tried to understand, because to what extent, where do we stop? Like, I'm constructing the world with my machinery, and I see the red color, but it's not there. It's just a frequency. Okay, what is that frequency? Where do we stop the construct of the universe? Mm-hmm. And there we have to ask questions, I guess, in terms of physics. What is reality? So we go to the object in itself now, the noumenon, and see what is it in itself. And that is where physics leads us to a fascinating journey into quantum mechanics, quantum field theories, and even nowadays, unified field theories. How many are familiar with just this line of kind of analysis? Not so much. Quickly, I can, if you think it's okay.
Yeah, we need to make sure we leave time for Q&A as well.
Yeah, right.
We're already...
Well,
yeah.
The Greeks said that if you take any object divided into pieces, you end up with something that is indivisible, which we call the atom. Atom means non-divisible. Now, in recent times, of course, recent 200 years or so or more, we know that the atom is made out of more elementary particles, electrons and neutrons and protons and all that. And we thought that was it. But then when the physicists went even deeper into that, they found that these are also made by more elementary particles. They call the quarks and all other particles. And then they fell into something which is totally unexpected, which is that these particles, they have a state in which they are non-local, and they have a probability of being practically anywhere, of course, probabilistically, and that they are interconnected in ways that is ununderstandable, which they call entanglement, for example, where objects even react to each other at amazing distances, and where even beyond the speed of light is an immediate interaction. And that's the weirdness of what's happening. And then what physicists came to find is that there are four main forces: the electromagnetic force, the weak force, the strong force, and the gravitational force that construct the entire universe. And more now there are theories that unify these fields, what they call them quantum mechanical fields or quantum fields, into more unified fields. And there is now a very strong theory that is superstring theory or M theory that actually describes the entire field of reality as one field, which is the unified field, manifesting itself through strings and etc. We don't need to go into that, as the electromagnetic field, the weak force, the strong force, and the gravitational field. So reality, in fact, is one field.
Well, we don't. I mean, firstly, I think there's an issue here. One of the issues is how you're totally right that when it comes to understanding the fundamental nature of reality, that's a question for a physicist, and physicists disagree about that. So string theory has been M theory, but no, you can't test it. It doesn't. It's very, very controversial whether it holds. And do you need to go there in order to understand the nature of consciousness? People who work from a more physicalist, material tradition like me often get, I think, sometimes rightly criticized for caricaturing matter. And these neurons just are it's all about neurons, and they fire or they don't fire, and that's all. And of course, there's much more going on. Even without getting into physics theories, the brain is very much more complicated than just a bunch of neurons wired together. There are chemicals sloshing around. Every neuron is a little tiny biological entity in its own right that's continually trying to maintain the conditions for its own persistence over time. And the deeper you go, the more complicated matter becomes. I find this actually a great argument in favor of materialism, because the resources of materialism are actually pretty huge once you realize how complicated matter can be. And most of the arguments against materialism just say, like, well, matter's too simple to explain, what happens. It's like, no, you don't. It's not. It really may not be. But yeah, I think I would resist trying to reach down to a fundamental theory of reality as a prerequisite for understanding consciousness, because firstly, you'll never get there, and I don't think you need to get there.
Well, I feel if you want an ultimate theory of reality, you need to have a convergence of findings, and they shouldn't clash with your theory. So if I propose, for example, like, I don't know, Leibniz or Schopenhauer to some extent, this comes into philosophy. And Spinoza certainly, and to some extent Plato, and certainly the ancient Advaita Vedantic expression that consciousness is primary. Yeah, I have to find logics that don't contradict the findings in nature about the reality and the ultimate reality.
Right, but also I think it's helpful if your assumptions lead to testable predictions. And this may seem a little arbitrary, because it may just be that the way things are is not something that ever leads to anything that's testable. But that would be a great shame, and it would mean that the scientific pursuit of consciousness is not the right way to go. But in the history of science, it's those ideas, whatever they may claim about the nature of things, if they can generate testable predictions, then you're in the game. And they could be, they're very rarely right, but they ratchet our understanding up. But the things have to be testable in that way. And that's why I think often the focus on choosing like an ism, a sort of assumption about the fundamental nature of things, is not usually, for me anyway, it's not the most helpful way to go, because often these things don't lead to testable predictions. There's a current fashion for panpsychism, which is consciousness is everywhere and universal, part of everything. This may be correct, but the problem with it is it's by definition not only not testable, but makes no difference to anything and doesn't even lead to anything that could in principle ever be tested. And so this is like quite a problem. It strikes me as if you're building a system of thought about consciousness on that, which is not what you're doing, but I worry that it might share some things there, because things need to, in science in general, you need to have explanatory power and the ability to generate something that's testable. And if you don't have those things, then it's
But that's exactly what I wanted to come to, is the explanatory power.
But what about the testability?
Testability is, if whether consciousness can influence, for example, your mind, your behavior, but there you can always argue that it's actually all a physical phenomenon. Mm-hmm. For example, I practice transcendental meditation, and it's a mental technique. Now, from the mind, you learn how to transcend, which means to go beyond the surface level of the mind, and that changes huge things in the physiology. And as we say, the interpretation of what you see can change your reactions. If you're walking in the street and it's dark and you see a rope in the street and you think it's a snake, you're startled, you can have a heart attack. So that's a mental picture of some object that is outside that actually is leading to physiological changes that are quite profound and quite important in certain cases. So mental phenomena do have an effect on physical phenomena. Now you can say, well, what is mental anyway? Yeah. Like Anita was saying, cannot tolerate to talk about mind. She wants to talk about mental states or something, or not mental states even, brain states. Yeah. So what is the actual explanatory power? That's the whole story. What explanation it can give to what? To phenomena in life that are very important, such as happiness, meaning of life, freedom, determinism, why we are here. The big questions that people are encountering that are not in the lab, but they are in the living, daily exchange of things that have no explanation on the physicalist platform. And therefore, why we are here, what is going on, without going to supernatural things. So it's explanatory power in that sense. And if you extend it also to the modern physics explanations of this multiverse things and all of that, the physicists now talk about multiverse, and they say this is the only way you can explain the wave function probability, because if it's not consciousness that collapses the wave function, then it means that all of these other possibilities exist, but they exist in different universes, and they are happy, and they tell you multiverse and all of that.
Yeah, but again, that's not necessary. I mean, that's just one. I mean, I worry that these things you're saying about physics, they're not settled, right?
Right, they're not settled, but they have to explain a phenomenon that they see, that they experience, The electron as a wave, it has a probability to be in all these places. When you observe it, it collapses. Now comes, all of them go to Copenhagen. They create the Copenhagen interpretation, which says it's the consciousness that collapses it. Nowadays, we don't want to have consciousness, so they say, well, that means all the other parts, where are they? And they say they are in different universes. I find this much more obnoxious or preposterous than a more simple explanation about consciousness. And that's what I try to put forward and explain the mechanism that can also contribute to understanding such phenomena. But yeah.
Okay, maybe before we open it up, because I think we should probably
close
it up to questions.
Yeah. Let's go to questions. Vincent wanted to ask for a while.
Vincent, can you use the mic, please? Thank you. It's on.
I need to go to another appointment, but I didn't want to miss the chance to throw this to both of you. When we're talking about the definition and what's necessary, we all agree that we're conscious. Nagel was fairly convinced that a bat is conscious. An insect, is an insect conscious? Is C. elegans with 302 neurons conscious?
Yeah.
At what point is something not conscious? Nature doesn't really like discontinuities. Isn't it a whole lot more of a Occam's razor explanation to presume that it is a continuous gradient? And if it's a continuous gradient, it's an infinite gradient.
Can I take that? I think it's a really, really good and important question. So some things, the two might not be, the idea of continuity is not incompatible with some things being conscious and other things being not, right? It's dark at night and it's light during the day. There's a continuous change, but at some point you've got a difference between the two. When you lose consciousness under anesthesia, there's still a transition. And just as you add individual grains of sand, at some point it starts becoming a pile, even though you've got a continuous underlying process. So I think it's a key question about, does consciousness gray out into nothingness or is it sharp? I'm quite comfortable with either way, but I still think it's compatible with saying some things, some organisms do not have conscious experiences. Which ones? That's a really important open question. In fact, tomorrow, there's something that's been in the works for a while. A bunch of us have this sort of thing, event in New York. I'll be there virtually, which is arguing that there's enough evidence now that many non-human species have a reasonable possibility of being conscious. And that's a very carefully phrased thing because definitive evidence is not there. But based on this gradual extrapolation from what we know about humans, what we know about primates, what we know about mammals, you can say, for instance, that for me, the areas of interest now are things like birds and bees and fish. It's quite possible that when we understand what's happening in those creatures, we may be in a position to say something about C. elegans. Right now, for me, C. elegans falls on the other side of the fence because everything we know about human consciousness doesn't apply to something that simple.
Just a parting comment. I think that is the profound gravity of anthropocentrism. It's extremely difficult for us to see outside of our frame.
Absolutely, absolutely. We can recognize that bias and try to, we can't escape it completely, but we can take it into account. Thank you.
I was curious about your comments on, if you have any reflections on the fact that it seems like intelligence is separate from sentience. You know, like a large language model might display intelligence, but it's not sentient.
Yeah.
And I guess previously I'm interested in astrobiology, origins of life, life on other planets. I always had naively maybe assumed they were on the same axis, and now we're seemingly orthogonal. Curious as to your thoughts.
Yeah, I think they're related. They may correlate in practice in biological systems, that the more intelligent in quotes, because we tend to, like the previous person said, we're human exceptionalists often. Being intelligent can give rise to a wider range of conscious experiences. Like to experience regret, you need the cognitive competence to be able to envisage alternative courses of action that didn't happen. But in principle, they're different things. Like, you can imagine organisms having experiences of suffering of some sort without being very intelligent. And I do think that this widespread assumption that AI is on a path to consciousness, which you see all the time, especially in the wider media coverage, the terms are often conflated. AGI is often conflated with consciousness. It's like, this is just a reflection of exactly the biases that gentleman was talking about. I don't think it's... So firstly, I think it's not going to come along for free just as systems get smarter. What will happen is we will be increasingly unable to resist attributing consciousness to language models. And that is a big disruptive problem in and of itself. But that's a very different problem from, is it actually conscious? And when we mix the two together, we prevent ourselves from thinking clearly about the risks involved. Machines that will incorrigibly appear to be conscious are almost here already, or are here, depending on who you ask. Machines that are actually consciousness, I think, are either a very long way away or not possible at all.
But this is within the range of your definition of consciousness.
Yeah,
Obviously.
but isn't it the one that, in this case, there's an ethical, I think there's an ethical obligation to define consciousness in a way that has grip here, because we want to talk about things that have the potential for suffering. And so I think to ground it in consciousness... It
doesn't have the potential for suffering, yet it is within the range of consciousness from 0 to a large value of consciousness, which means it is detecting, sensing, responding, analyzing, putting things together. It doesn't mean it has a sense of self. It doesn't mean it has a sense of its own personal future or not. But when you extend the definition of consciousness to include those sensing, detecting, and
but then I think that's back to the start. I think when you do that, you lose the ability to explain anything at all. You lose the ability to explain the difference between things that we take as being conscious and things that are not.
Well, things that being alive and being a person as having a moral responsibility towards them, yes. But in terms of the paradigm that allows you to give a more extended definition of consciousness and all its explanatory power, it works very well in my perspective.
Take another question, shall we?
This is a little out of left field, but there are two sets of human experiences that people have widely reported that at least have been attributed to the idea of non-materialism, that consciousness is outside of the human body. The first is near-death experiences, which seem to be very consistent in different cultures and through the ages. And the second are people, young children, who appear to have knowledge that they couldn't possibly have acquired during their young lifetimes that some people interpret as evidence of reincarnation. I've talked to people who have both those kinds of experiences. I'm just curious how those fit into the models of consciousness from your guys' points of view.
Okay,
well, this takes us to the supernatural a little bit, and we try to avoid that in such a discussion, because even when you look at those phenomena of near-death experience or almost death experience, There are studies about brainwave changes, and that they have these even when there was a flat EEG.
No.
No. So they do have some spikes, and there are ways to interpret them differently. So if you want to put it in the context of a scientific analysis, you get in trouble with the scientists.
No, hold on. I don't think that's right. I think the two examples are interestingly different, right? I think so. Near-death experiences are fascinating. They're very significant for the people that have them, and so we don't want to dismiss them. But I think there's a difference between taking an experience seriously and taking it literally. It's the same with things like out-of-body experiences, which can be part of NDEs as well. People have the experiences they say they have, but it doesn't mean they signify what they think they signify. An out-of-body experience is not evidence for the fact that the soul has left the body. What is evidence for is the fact that the brain is constructing the experience of where the body is, or where the first-person perspective is. The reason near-death experiences are very consistent across cultures is that there's a very natural biological explanation for the things that people report, like tunnels of light, things like that. As blood drains from the visual cortex, that is exactly what you would expect to see. Evidence from Jimo Borgnon's lab in Michigan on animals shows that you see these big bursts of gamma activity at just shortly before death. Nobody can know what's going on for the rat in question, but there's stuff happening in the brain which is plausibly associated with kinds of experiences that people later report. Of course, you can't do a near-death experience on a human in a lab, and so we don't have that data. What we do have, what my lab is actually analyzing, is data from humans as they die, which is a very unusual kind of data. But in a collaboration, we have some data now from, this is with Jimo Borgnon, we have for about 10, 15 people whose life support was turned off while they have EEG on, so we can see what's happening. Anyway, so I think it's a very, very, very acceptable, approachable scientific question. The other example, on the other hand,
I just want to make
is not. Let me just make this contrast. The other example is not, right? There is no reasonable materialist explanation for how a newborn child could have memories of a past life. Now, if that is true, then basically all of neuroscience about consciousness is wrong. So that kind of claim requires extraordinary evidence, and the extraordinary evidence just isn't there. It's very anecdotal. There are reports, but in my book, it doesn't reach the standards of evidence required to substantiate something that would overturn so much of established science.
Yeah, what I meant is not to take those experiences seriously, because for one thing, I've had a near-death experience myself. I have some condition, and I know it's real. What I meant is that the interpretation of what it means and to deduce from that there is something supernatural will not be taken seriously from the scientist perspective. So we can't use it as an argument. But whether the experience is real, I'm first to say it happens.
My name's Dan. I also had a near-death experience 6 years ago, which I'm happy to talk about later for anyone who wants to talk shop about near-death experiences. My question specifically for Tony, I wanted to better understand your position, so this is a clarifying question. It's about understanding the fundamental nature of reality and understanding consciousness, and I wanted to make sure I was tracking your inquiry correctly. Are you suggesting it's imperative to understand the fundamental nature of reality because consciousness wouldn't exist without it, or possibly suggesting that consciousness is the fundamental nature of reality, or both? I wanted to understand that position.
Well, it's in the question of the mind-body problem and which is primary. And so if physicality is primary, then you would say, where is physicality coming from? How does it develop? And how does it create consciousness, ultimately, as an emergent phenomenon or quality? There is the other point of view, which also has been suggested and talked to, that actually consciousness is primary. So that unified field is not a proven thing today. We can't use it as an argument, but there are converging arguments that allow you to have a theory that need to be tested, that has explanatory power, and therefore we say it's an axiom, it's a theory, that let's say there is a unified field, and that's say that field, which is a unified, which means like an ocean, and then the surface waves, and the waves are the manifestation of particles, fluctuations of the field, and the ocean is the field. And let's say there is a field which is consciousness. It solves the problem of consciousness and being a primary thing, not necessarily panpsychism, because panpsychism also means duality.
No, it doesn't. Anyway, I don't want to get into that though.
Yeah, we don't want to get there. But there are panpsychists that are dualists because they think there is a, anyway, let's leave that. But cosmopsychism and these are different theories that are coming. What I'm proposing is to solve the problem of consciousness. We say that consciousness is primary. And now the explanation that has to happen is how the manifest universe appears to be real through the dynamics of consciousness. And when I talked about what is reality, it was meant to which level of doubt about how the brain and the nervous system constructs reality, to which layer of nature do you go? To the surface layer, to the quantum mechanical layer, to the quantum field layer, to the unified field layer, which means that ultimately everything is the unified field vibrating like an ocean showing waves on the surface. Now, if you remove the wave, you don't discard the ocean. So that is the point. Now, how does it appear? That is discussed. It's a long discussion. In the ancient tradition, they call Maya. It's an illusion. Some people feel we are a simulation. It's a holographic thing, but I'm not referring to those. But I have my own logic of how it emerges. I want to add that the paradigm of consciousness being primary does not reject any of the scientific findings. It just has to fit within it for it to be acceptable. And that's what we are searching, is how a primary consciousness can have explanatory power and can fit within all the scientific findings on the surface. And that is the challenge, and that is what we didn't have time to go through. That's why I discuss it here in this book, but there is also this great book here.
We'd love to hear how to get those books.
It's a fabulous book.
Maybe, Anil, you can tell us a little bit about how to get your book, and Dr. Nader also.
Oh yeah, I mean, so I've been in this constant battle. They only had 5 copies at TED, and they all sold out before the conference started, which is slightly annoying. But they have been trying to deliver more copies to the bookstore, but they may not get here until tomorrow afternoon, which is just perfect. They may get here earlier, so have a look. Otherwise, of course, it's at Amazon. All good bookstores and Amazon.
Dr. Nader?
Well, this book takes the primacy of consciousness to explain how it could explain the universe, and also particularly how it can give us an idea about the meaning of life, freedom, determinism, good and bad, and gives us a measure on the basis of the most simple first theory that consciousness is primary and it's consciousness interacting with itself that leads to the phenomenon that we see on the surface. It acknowledges that all science that we know and the scientific method and the discoveries are for real. So it has a full realism about science and full respect to scientific findings, yet it demonstrates that consciousness can be primary and can explain more than science. It can explain big questions in life and evolution and reasons why we are here, responsibility, etc. So I welcome you to look at it.
That drnaderbooks.com.
It is coming in the summer, in August 6th, but you can pre-order it.
There we go. Do we have any closing words?
Just to thank everybody for coming. I hope you enjoyed the discussion, and it's
yeah, thank you for your patience.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.